I knew something was off the moment I saw the envelope. It was a thin, bright notice wedged between the slats of our still-drying fence, the paper already curling from the damp morning air. What really got me was the timestamp on the top corner, 7:52 a.m. The fence posts had been set only the evening before, the concrete barely cured, yet I was already being slapped with a 24-hour violation demand before anyone could have reasonably measured anything. The sun was still low over the cul-de-sac, throwing long shadows from the maple tree onto the pavement. Sprinklers clicked and hissed somewhere down the block, that early morning quiet where you can hear birds over cars. I stood there in my slippers, holding a piece of paper that told me I had exactly 1 day to fix a problem the board hadn't even bothered to understand. The letter claimed my new fence exceeded the allowed height for front adjacent structures. It ordered me to cut the panels down to 4 feet and submit before and after photos to the architectural committee by the next morning. The part that really stuck under my skin was a line near the bottom that said the measurement had been visually confirmed after a concerned neighbor's report in the middle of the night. No tape measure, no written inspection, just some midnight complaint and a rush to punish. I remember this weird mix of anger and disbelief. We had just poured money into this project, lined everything up with city code, and hired a licensed contractor. The fence was supposed to give my family some much-needed privacy from exactly the kind of person who calls the association at midnight. I folded the notice in half, then in half again, and slipped it into my hoodie pocket. Instead of firing off an email or storming into the board president's driveway, I walked back into the house and grabbed the heavy binder the association had given us when we moved in. On the spine, in fading silver letters, it said, Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Buried inside that binder was Bylaw 7.3. I didn't know it yet, but that little section about fences, screens, and trellises would become my quiet weapon. Before this was over, they'd realize they picked the wrong homeowner to bully based on a nosy neighbor's late-night phone call. As I set the binder on the kitchen table and flipped it open, the house still smelled faintly of fresh-cut lumber from the fence work. My kids were half asleep in the next room, the soft murmur of a morning cartoon drifting through, and my wife moved around the kitchen, the clink of a mug on the counter grounding me for a second. This was supposed to be a normal Saturday. Instead, it was the opening scene of my own little abuse of power saga with our association. I just didn't know yet how far they were going to push it, and how far I'd be willing to push back. We moved into the cul-de-sac about 6 months before the fence drama exploded. On paper, it looked perfect. A quiet loop of brickfront homes, small lawns lined with identical ornamental trees, and a playground at the center. The listing described it as a well-maintained community with an active homeowners association, which at the time sounded like a good thing. The association had a table set up the day we closed, like they were welcoming us to a private club. There was a sign-in sheet, a stack of glossy newsletters, and a plastic bin filled with reusable tote bags sporting the community logo. The board president, a man I'll call Mr. K, shook my hand and gave me that look people give when they're already judging you by your shoes, your car, your entire existence. He slid the big binder toward me and tapped the cover with the back of his knuckles. He told me that everything I needed to know about living here was inside that book. I remember flipping it open that night and seeing lines and lines of tiny text, setback lines, mailbox standards, pre-approved paint colors, restrictions on everything from flag placement to basketball hoops. Somewhere near the middle, I saw Section 7, Fences and Screens, but I didn't read it too carefully. At the time, it felt like boring background noise. The real warning sign should have been our neighbor at the corner, the one the other residents quietly referred to as the Night Watch. I'll call her Miss Carter. She had a habit of sitting in a lawn chair on her front porch with a tablet in her lap, half watching the street, half scrolling. Whenever someone parked with a wheel touching the grass, whenever a trash can sat out after noon, you could see her fingers moving fast on that screen. Within our first month, we got a friendly email from the board about leaving our recycling bin visible from the street. That same week, our other neighbor mentioned, in passing, that Miss Carter had once taken pictures of a delivery truck that stayed too long in front of her house and forwarded them to the treasurer. The way people told those stories, it had that resigned tone, like weather you can't change. By month 2, I could tell the board loved their power. They called them reminders instead of warnings, community standards instead of rules, but the message was clear: they decided what normal looked like on this block. When I stood outside and listened on still evenings, you could hear garage doors humming open in perfect sequence, lawns being mowed at exact intervals, that faint hum of everything being slightly too controlled. Our house backed onto a small drainage easement, and on one side, our yard shared a property line with Miss Carter. At first that didn't bother me. There was a short, aging picket fence that technically belonged to the previous owner, but it leaned, sagged, and did nothing to block the view. Our dog could stick his entire head through the gaps. Over time, it felt like we were living in a fishbowl. If we sat on the patio at night with the string lights on, I could feel Miss Carter's gaze from her porch. If the kids played with chalk in the driveway, she would pause on her daily walk and make little comments about the dust or how far the chalk reached. Never loud enough to cause a scene, always just pointed enough to remind us she was paying attention. The first real hint of trouble came in the form of a small printout slipped into our mailbox, something labeled architectural reminder. It wasn't even an official violation, just a note about visible toys being left out overnight and trash cans not being fully behind the side gate. The wording was stiff, but at the bottom was a familiar name, Miss Carter, listed as a community watch liaison. It was like finding out the neighborhood gossip had somehow been promoted to a semi-official position. I didn't know it yet, but that title meant she had a direct line to the board. She wasn't just complaining to empty air, she was feeding them information. Then came the dog. Our dog is not aggressive, but he is loud. Every time Miss Carter walked past our side yard, he would bark. She started timing her walks so that she passed during his peak energy period, usually just before dinner, when kids were loud and traffic was light. I noticed her leaning closer to the fence, staring into our yard while the dog barked himself hoarse. I started thinking about a taller fence in a vague, someday way. Nothing dramatic, just something that would give us a little privacy and muffle the sound. I checked the city website first. The municipal code allowed 6-foot fences in the side and rear yards with a simple permit. The old picket fence we'd inherited was useless anyway. At that point, I still believed that if I followed city rules and used a licensed contractor, everything would be fine. I glanced at the association binder, saw the pages about fences, and told myself I'd come back to it when we were closer to actually building. I had no idea how much that assumption would cost me. The fence project really began on a windy Thursday in early spring. The sky was that flat gray that makes everything look sharper, and you could hear the gusts rattling the old picket fence as the contractor walked the property line with me. He pointed out the rotting posts and the places where the boards were so warped you could see right through into Miss Carter's yard. We talked about the layout. I told him I wanted a 6-foot privacy fence along the side and back, something solid enough that the dog couldn't see every passing car and every neighbor walking by. He mentioned he had done several fences in nearby neighborhoods with similar associations, and city permitting wouldn't be a problem. In the days before work started, I finally sat down with that binder and turned to Section 7. Bylaw 7.3 was written in dense, legalistic language, but I read it over twice. It said that fences up to 6 feet were allowed in rear and side yards, as long as they didn't extend beyond the front building line of the home. It also mentioned that decorative trellises and screens could be added above fences in certain cases, with board approval, as long as total height did not exceed an overall limit. I noticed there was some wiggle room in how they defined rear versus front adjacent, and I filed that away without fully understanding how important it would be. Wanting to play nice, I submitted the contractor's sketch and a short description to the architectural email address listed in the binder. I attached a simple image with measurements and noted that everything was within city code and within the 6-foot maximum for side and rear fencing stated in Bylaw 7.3. I heard nothing back. No approval, no denial, not even a clarification request. Just silence. After 2 weeks, I assumed no news was good news. The city had already stamped the permit, and our start date with the contractor was locked in. The crew showed up on a Friday afternoon. The light was fading, that cool early evening where the air smells like sawdust and damp soil when you break ground. They pulled out the old picket fence in sections, stacking the broken boards like bones along the curb. Post holes were dug along the property line, string lines were drawn tight, and by the time the sun dipped behind the roofs, the new posts were set in concrete, standing like a line of dark sentries along the edge of the yard. That's when I noticed Miss Carter's porch light flick on. Even over the sound of the auger and the clink of concrete bags, I could feel the weight of her attention. She stood near her porch rail, arms folded, watching every post go in. Later that night, after the crew left, I took the dog out one last time. The wind had died down, and the street was quiet. A single street lamp buzzed softly at the end of the cul-de-sac. I stepped into the yard and saw the silhouette of Miss Carter at one of her windows, the pale rectangle of her tablet glowing against the glass. I didn't hear her, but I imagined her scrolling through contacts, tapping on the name of a board member, or maybe drafting one of those long, dramatic emails about sudden changes to the neighborhood character. I shrugged it off and went to bed. The next morning, the violation notice was waiting. A single sheet of paper, printed in bold, with 24-hour compliance demand at the top and fence height exceeds approved limit in the subject line. The letter referenced a midnight report from a concerned homeowner and claimed the association had visually determined that the fence height exceeded the maximum allowed. They had issued an order to cut the fence down before the full panels were even installed. The posts were bare, no one had measured anything. The notice was dated that same day, but the urgency screamed through every line, as if my unfinished fence were an emergency. It even included a reference number and the notation attached to file, fence case 24-031. At the bottom of the letter, there was a line I would come to know very well: failure to comply may result in immediate fines and further enforcement action. It was signed electronically and stamped with a scanned signature, like something out of a bureaucratic drama. On the back, there was a copy of what they called a final notice template, oddly enough, even though this was labeled the first notice. That letter became my first real evidence prop in this battle, a 24-hour violation notice dated April 4th, with no inspection log, no measurement, just the vague claim of a nighttime complaint. I slid it into a plastic sheet protector and tucked it into the front of the binder holding the CC and RS. What the board did not realize that morning was that their rushed 24-hour deadline would become the very thing that exposed how sloppy, and how abusive, their power really was. I sat at the kitchen table with the binder open to bylaw 7.3 and the violation notice laid flat beside it. The light through the window made the thin paper almost translucent, and I could see the bold header bleeding through the back. I ran my finger along the lines of the bylaw, reading the section about allowable fence height again. It clearly permitted 6-foot fences in rear and side yards. The only restriction was that anything closer to the street than the front wall of the house had to stay low. The problem, as I would soon learn, was that the board had their own unofficial interpretation of where the front started. In their minds, anything along the side that anyone could see from the sidewalk counted as front adjacent. In other words, if they could see it, they felt they could control it. From that moment, the conflict shifted in my head. This was no longer about a fence. It was about whether the association could twist its own written rules just because a nosy neighbor didn't like looking at wooden posts in her peripheral vision. I could feel something click into place inside me. I decided I wasn't going to just roll over, cut my fence down, and apologize for existing. I was going to read every line of bylaw 7.3 and every related section until I understood it better than they did. The wind outside picked up, making the new posts creak slightly in their curing concrete. Somewhere a garage door rattled shut, and the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood made the letter in front of me feel even more absurd. The board was acting like my half-built fence was an emergency, a breach of order that had to be crushed in a single day. As I turned the page and saw more about attached structures and additional height allowances for lattice or trellis work, a small, petty idea started forming in the back of my mind. I wasn't just going to defend my fence. If they wanted to get technical, I would get technical. If they wanted to lean on the exact wording of their documents, I'd use those same words to build something they couldn't easily tear down. They had 24 hours on that notice. What they didn't know yet was that I had much more time, and I had the patience to study every comma in that bylaw until I found a way to turn their own rules into my shield. And eventually, into my revenge. From there, the next few days turned into a strange waiting game. I sent a calm, detailed email to the architectural address listed in the binder, attaching photos of the unfinished fence, the city permit, and a scan of the 24-hour violation notice dated April 4th. I quoted the exact line from bylaw 7.3 that allowed 6-foot fences inside and rear yards and asked, politely, how they had visually confirmed a height violation when there were no panels yet. Hours passed with no response. The contractor texted me to ask whether he should continue or pause. I told him to hold off on the panels along Miss Carter's side until I got clarity. I did not want to give the board any excuse to say I was ignoring their notice. The posts stayed there, bare and tall, like a row of mute witnesses along the property line. Out on the street, the quiet of the cul-de-sac felt different. When I stepped outside, I could feel eyes on the fence line, that subtle way people slow their walk and pretend to look at their phones while actually staring. The unfinished fence had become a kind of neighborhood spectacle. The air was cool, with a faint smell of mulch from someone's fresh landscaping, and it made the whole standoff feel strangely theatrical. Miss Carter started making more frequent passes along the sidewalk. She kept her tablet angled just enough that I could see the camera lens reflecting the light. She would pause, tilt the screen toward the fence posts, tap, and then move on. It was like watching someone document a crime scene, except that crime was a row of perfectly legal posts waiting for boards. I checked my email every hour. Nothing. No reply, no acknowledgement, just silence from the association. The only thing that showed up that weekend was a short automated message confirming that my complaint had been received and would be reviewed in the order it was received. It was the kind of generic response that said everything and nothing at once. By Monday afternoon, a new envelope appeared in our physical mailbox. The metal box gave a dull clang when I pulled it open, and the air inside was warm from the midday sun. On top of the usual flyers and coupons sat a plain white envelope from the association, folded sharply like someone had pressed the edges with unnecessary force. Inside was a second letter, labeled "Pre-fine warning." This time they claimed that because I had failed to comply with the original 24-hour notice, the board would convene at its next regular meeting to consider fines and additional enforcement. They still had not answered the question about how they measured a fence that did not exist yet. Instead, they doubled down, stating that the posts clearly indicated the fence would be taller than allowed near the street. They included a grainy printed photo, obviously taken at night with a phone. You could see the outline of the posts illuminated by a porch light, and in the bottom corner, the faint blurred shape of someone's shadow. There was no tape measure, no reference point, just perspective distortion from a standing angle. Reading that letter, I felt something sharp settle in my chest. It was not just irritation anymore, it was the realization that this was not a misunderstanding, it was a power play. They were not interested in facts, they were interested in obedience. I went back to the binder. This time, I did not stop at bylaw 7.3. I flipped to the enforcement section, the part that most people probably skim once and never revisit. That was where I found CCR section 4.3, Notice and Mailbox Rule. It spelled out, in surprisingly clear language, how violations had to be delivered, certified mail to the owner of record, with a specific number of days to respond, and the right to request a hearing before any fine could be imposed. None of that matched what they were doing. They had stuffed a rushed violation notice between fence posts and followed it up with a pre-fine warning, dropped in my mailbox like a pizza coupon. No certified mail, no proper time frame, no mention of a hearing. That discovery became my second key evidence prop, CCR section 4.3 mailbox rule, underlined in red in the binder, with sticky notes marking the page. I realized that if they wanted to play technical games with fence height, I could play technical games with their own procedures. The board thought they were pressuring me with deadlines and warnings. What they were really doing was piling up procedural mistakes that could cost them thousands if they pushed their luck and tried to fine me anyway. As the week went on, the tension in our little loop of houses thickened. The contractor called again, asking whether the job was cancelled. He reminded me that his crew's schedule was tight. If we delayed much longer, he would have to push the project by weeks. That meant extra cost, and the prospect settled over my budget like a dark cloud. At the same time, I started hearing small rumors floating around. A neighbor mentioned in passing that the board was cracking down on unapproved changes. Another told me they had seen my fence issue listed as a line item on the upcoming board agenda. It was like my yard had become a kind of low-level entertainment, something people whispered about on evening walks when the porch lights clicked on one by one. The official agenda finally appeared on the community portal, a PDF with the usual dry list of topics: financial report, landscaping contract renewal, pool opening schedule. Halfway down the page was a line that made my stomach tighten: Fence Case 24-031, Compliance Discussion. I saved that document, printed it, and slid it behind the mailbox rule page. Board Agenda Excerpt, Fence Case 24-031, became evidence prop number 3. The case now had an official name in their records, which meant they were treating it as a precedent-setting issue. That was when the stakes shifted from an annoying letter to something more serious. If they decided to fine me and I paid without a fight, it would embolden them. It would become one more story they told about homeowners who tried to change things and were corrected by the wise, watchful association. I decided I wasn't going to be that story. The night of the board meeting, the air outside was heavy and still, with a low cloud cover that reflected the streetlights back down, making the whole cul-de-sac glow faintly. As I walked to the clubhouse where they held their meetings, I could hear the soft hum of distant traffic and the muffled thud of a basketball from the playground. Inside, the room smelled like coffee and printed paper. A long folding table sat at the front with the board members lined up behind it, Mr. K in the center, the treasurer to his left, and 2 at-large members flanking them. A small group of residents sat in metal chairs facing the front, flipping through agendas and whispering. They opened with routine business. Budget numbers, maintenance updates, a brief discussion about whether the playground mulch needed refreshing. My case felt absurdly out of proportion to the mundane tone of the meeting, yet I could feel it looming in the middle of the agenda like a storm cell on a radar map. When they finally reached Fence Case 24-031, Mr. K looked up and asked if the homeowner was present. I raised my hand and stood, holding my binder. I had printed copies of Bylaw 7.3, the city permit, the mailbox rule, and the board agenda excerpt listing my case. I had even highlighted the part of the city code that required a minimum barrier height for any yard designated as a protective enclosure for a dog, which our permit referenced for safety. The board presented their side first. They showed enlarged versions of the grainy photos Miss Carter had taken at night, pointing to the way the posts dominated the sightline from the street. They referred repeatedly to community character and visual harmony, phrases that did not appear anywhere in Bylaw 7.3 but sounded impressive when said slowly. When it was my turn, I walked through the documents calmly. I pointed to the exact wording of Bylaw 7.3 that allowed 6-foot fences in side yards, then to the city permit, which was stamped and time-stamped. I explained that the fence panels had not even been installed at the time of the original notice, so no one could have accurately measured anything yet. I noted that the required certified notice under CCR Section 4.3 had never been sent, which meant that any move toward fines right now might violate their own procedures. I mentioned, clearly and without anger, that the city's minimum safety height requirement for the specific permit type was 4 feet, and that the board's suggestion that I cut the fence down to something closer to 3 feet would actually put me out of compliance with the municipal code. The room was very quiet while I spoke, the overhead fluorescents buzzing faintly. The board did not like it. They retreated to vague statements about discretion and interpretation. They claimed that the front half of my side yard was visually front adjacent and therefore subject to a shorter height, even though that phrase appeared nowhere in the written rules. They hinted that failure to maintain harmony could be considered a violation in itself, even if the specific height wording was technically ambiguous. It was a classic power move: admit nothing, concede nothing, and imply that they could always find another rule to lean on. Then the treasurer mentioned, almost casually, that if the board voted to fine me and I chose to fight back formally, I would be responsible for any legal costs if I lost, which, according to him, could easily run into the high 4 figures. That was the moment the conflict became about money. This was no longer just a fence or a matter of principle. They were signaling that they were willing to put thousands of dollars on the line to enforce their interpretation, and they expected me to blink first. They ended the segment by tabling the final decision for further review, but kept the threat of fines on the record. In practice, that meant they could come after me in a month or 2, claiming they had given me ample time to comply. It was a slow, grinding pressure, the kind that wears people down until they give in just to make it stop. Walking back home that night, the air felt cooler, and a faint breeze stirred the tree branches along the sidewalk. Porch lights glowed in quiet rows, and behind one of them, I could see Miss Carter's familiar silhouette. She stood at her window with the room lit behind her, watching the street as if waiting for a verdict. I realized that this was all part of the same pattern. A neighbor who liked to push boundaries, a board that enjoyed wielding authority, and a set of rules that they treated like a menu instead of a binding document. They picked whichever parts suited them in the moment. Over the next few weeks, the situation simmered instead of boiling. The contractor moved on to other jobs, and our bare fence posts stood there like unfinished sentences. The yard looked half renovated, half abandoned, and I could feel the subtle judgment in the way people glanced over as they drove by with windows down in the warm afternoon air. I kept collecting documents. I requested a written copy of everything in my file, including the original complaint. After some delay, the management company sent over a packet that included a final notice dated May 12, even though I had never seen an intermediate notice labeled anything else. The language in that document was harsh, talking about escalating enforcement and additional costs to be assessed. The date on the final notice did not match the postmark on the envelope it supposedly came in. The envelope, which I had kept tucked in a kitchen drawer, was postmarked 3 days after the date on the letter. It was another small, telling inconsistency in their process, another detail that revealed how aggressively they were trying to push this through. That final notice became another piece in my growing folder of evidence, a physical reminder that even on paper, they were sloppy. I watched the board's behavior in other matters too. When they sent a community-wide reminder about trash placement, the tone was eerily similar to the letters I was getting. Formal, stiff, and just slightly menacing. They talked about the integrity of the neighborhood as if they were guarding some fragile secret, not just lawn lines and paint colors. The more I saw, the clearer the pattern became. This was an association that enjoyed flexing its power, especially when backed by residents like Miss Carter who seemed to thrive on reporting anything that deviated from her idea of perfection. It had all the hallmarks of a textbook HOA nightmare, the kind of situation that turns a simple disagreement into a long-running power struggle. At the same time, I knew I could not let this drag on forever. The longer the fence stayed unfinished, the more it affected our everyday life. The dog barked at every passerby, the kids had no real privacy in the yard, and every time I stepped onto the patio, I could feel Miss Carter's attention from next door. That was when I went back to Bylaw 7.3 with a different mindset. Instead of looking for permission, I started looking for leverage. At this point, I had a half-built fence, a stack of letters, and a board that seemed determined to force me into cutting my fence below the city's own safety code. I also had a binder full of bylaws, a mailbox rule they were ignoring, and an emerging pattern of sloppy notices that could undermine their position if they tried to turn this into a fine heavy war. As I traced the lines of Bylaw 7.3 with my thumb, one phrase kept catching my eye: decorative trellises and screens may be permitted above fences in side and rear yards, provided total height does not exceed the overall limit and the structure is at least 50% open. The board had never brought that part up. They had focused entirely on the base fence height, treating the fence and any structure above it as the same thing. But the bylaw clearly separated them. There was the fence, and then there were decorative trellises and screens that could extend higher as long as certain conditions were met. Somewhere between the frustration and the legalese, an idea began to take shape, something both petty and perfectly legal. One warm evening, as the sky faded from blue to that soft purple you only get in late spring, I sat on the patio with the binder, a notepad, and a tape measure. The hum of air conditioners and distant lawnmowers floated through the still air. Our fence posts stood in a neat line, casting long shadows across the yard. I sketched out a design. The base fence would stay at the 6-foot height allowed by Bylaw 7.3 for side yards set back behind the front building line. That part was straightforward and already supported by the city permit. Above that, instead of a solid extension, I would add a series of decorative trellises, open, lattice-like structures with spacing that clearly met the 50% open requirement in the bylaw. The key detail was the overall height. The bylaw capped the combined fence and trellis height at a number slightly above what most people would ever build. It was there, probably, for ornamental purposes, but it gave me room to work. If I built to that maximum overall height, I could create a tall, airy screen that not only satisfied the association's written rules but also provided more privacy than my original fence plan ever would have. The thought of it made me smile for the first time in weeks. I pictured Miss Carter watching the installation, expecting the fence to be cut down as the board had demanded, only to see a fully compliant structure rise higher than she had imagined, one that blocked her view even more effectively while staying inside the exact lines of Bylaw 7.3. I knew I could not rush it. This needed to be done carefully and by the book. I started drafting a new architectural request, this time citing the bylaw line by line. I described the fence and trellis as separate components, listed their heights, and included diagrams showing the 50% open design of the trellis panels. I attached the city permit again and referenced CCR Section 4.3 in my cover letter, noting politely that any response should follow the notice procedures outlined there. The board wanted obedience and quick compliance, but what they were about to get instead was a homeowner who used their own rules to build something taller, stronger, and far more visible than the simple fence they tried to crush. As I finalized the packet, I slipped in copies of the earlier letters, the mismatched dates, and the final notice dated May 12. I was not sending those as a threat, I wanted them on record as part of the history of the case. If they denied a detailed, fully compliant request without a clear written reason, it would only reinforce the pattern I was starting to see. When I dropped the new application into the certified mail slot at the post office, the faint metallic clatter as it slid into the bin felt satisfying. This time, I was the one invoking the mailbox rule. I kept the receipt and added it to my binder. Back at home, I walked the fence line again, running my hand along the tops of the posts. The dog trotted beside me, pausing to sniff where the old fence had once stood. The yard still felt exposed, but now there was a quiet sense of momentum. The situation was no longer stuck, it was moving toward something. I still had no guarantee the board would approve my trellis plan. They could try to twist more definitions or stall, or they might call another meeting to discuss concerns. But for the first time since the 24-hour violation notice appeared, I felt like I was playing offense instead of defense. What they did not realize was that every stall, every vague phrase, every document with mismatched dates was reinforcing the same central story, an association willing to bend its own procedures to appease one nosy neighbor. And if they pushed too hard against a request that followed their own rules down to the comma, they might finally find themselves answering for that pattern in front of more than just a small clubhouse crowd. The first sign that my certified application had landed came in the form of silence. Not the anxious, empty kind of silence I had before, where no one responded and the fence posts just stood there like an unfinished sentence. This was a different kind of quiet, no new threats, no surprise envelopes, no fresh reminders about community harmony. It felt less like they had forgotten me and more like they were regrouping. A week after I mailed the packet, I got a short, neutral email from the management company confirming receipt of my revised architectural submission and noting that it would be reviewed at the next scheduled board meeting. For the first time since this started, they used the right procedural language. They mentioned the date of the meeting, my right to attend, and the fact that I could submit supporting documents for the record. That email might not have looked like much, but buried inside it was a subtle shift. They were finally acknowledging that I had rights in this process, not just obligations. In the days leading up to that meeting, I decided to push a little further. The air had turned hot and heavy, the kind of early summer heat that made the pavement shimmer in the afternoon. Under that hazy light, the bare fence posts looked almost skeletal along the edge of the yard. I sent a formal records request to the management company, asking to inspect any prior approvals involving fences, trellises, or decorative screens along side yards. Most people never ask for things like that, but the governing documents gave owners the right to see non-confidential records. I framed the request calmly and professionally, just like everything else. The manager replied with a time slot 2 days later. I drove to their office on my lunch break, stepping into a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner. The air conditioning hummed overhead, cool and steady. They handed me a binder of past architectural approvals and a stack of printed emails, then left me alone in a small conference room with a flickering fluorescent light. As I flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. There were multiple approvals for fences and trellises on other streets in the community. One house had a side yard trellis that clearly rose above the fence line and was visible from the road. Another had a decorative screen near the front corner of the house that pushed what I would consider the limit of rear yard by any reasonable standard. Both had been stamped approved with no conditions. Then I turned a page and saw a familiar name. Ms. Carter's property had a file. A few years earlier, she had submitted a request to install a decorative privacy screen on her side patio, essentially a tall, slatted panel near the front corner of her house. The approval form was brief, with a handwritten note that said, "Approved as submitted, screen considered accessory." Her structure, from the photos in the file, was at least as visible from the street as anything I was proposing. Yet she had gotten a quick, easy approval. No threats, no midnight photos, no 24-hour demands. I took careful notes. I was not looking to get her in trouble, that was not the point. The point was consistency. If the board tried to argue that my fence and trellis would dominate the sightline or disrupt community character, I could show that they had already approved similar or more visible projects for other owners, including the very neighbor who had triggered my case. The more inconsistencies I documented, the more obvious it became that if the board tried to escalate this into fines or legal action, they would be stepping into a fight they might actually lose, not just in a meeting room but on paper where selective enforcement and sloppy procedures start to look like a real liability. Driving home from the management office that day, the sky was bright and cloudless, the sunlight glaring off car hoods. I passed the entrance monument for our community and glanced at the tidy landscaping around it. Everything looked so orderly from the outside, like a picture-perfect brochure. You would never guess that behind those neat hedges, one homeowner had to treat a simple fence like a research project just to keep the association from bulldozing over him. Back at the cul-de-sac, I noticed small changes. A neighbor across the loop had added a few extra potted plants near their front door, slightly outside the approved pallet. Another had installed a small bench under their tree. Nothing major, just small signs that people were making this place feel like their homes, not like museum pieces. It made me even more determined to see this through. This was about my fence, yes, but it was also about whether this neighborhood was going to be ruled by fear of complaints from neighbors from hell, or by reasonable interpretations of written rules. On the morning of the next board meeting, I slipped my notes, photos, and copies of the approvals into my binder. The 24-hour violation notice dated April 4th, the final notice dated May 12th, the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule, and the board agenda excerpt with Fence Case 24-031 all sat in their plastic sleeves, ready. I did not know exactly how the night would go, but I knew I was walking in prepared. The clubhouse was warmer this time, crowded with more residents than usual. The evening light filtered through the blinds and slanted stripes, and the low murmur of conversation filled the room like a steady background hum. I saw a few new faces, people I had never seen at meetings before. A couple of them gave me small, knowing nods. Word had gotten around that the board was about to settle, or escalate, the fence case. At the front table, the board members looked a little more rigid than usual. The treasurer had a thick stack of papers in front of him. Next to Mr. K sat a representative from the management company, a woman who seemed to be flipping through a folder with my name on the tab. They moved quickly through the routine items, clearly trying to get to the main event. When they reached Fence Case 24-031, revised submission, the room grew quieter. You could hear the soft buzz of the overhead lights and the faint whir of the ceiling fan. They gave a brief summary of my revised application: 6-foot side and rear fence, decorative trellis panels above, combined height within the overall limit specified by Bylaw 7.3, design submitted with diagrams and measurements. Then they opened the floor to me. I stood up, binder in hand, and walked to the small podium they used for owner comments. My heart raced a little, but it was a steady, focused beat, not the panicked rush I had felt at the first meeting. I outlined my case calmly. I explained how the original 24-hour violation notice had been issued before the fence panels were even installed, based on nighttime photos of bare posts. I pointed out that no certified notice had been sent, even though CCR Section 4.3 required proper delivery for any enforcement action. I showed how the suggested lower fence would have put me below the city's minimum safety height for the dog enclosure permit on file. Then I turned to Bylaw 7.3. I read the key sentence about decorative trellises and screens aloud, emphasizing the phrase, provided total height does not exceed the overall limit and the structure is at least 50% open. My design, I explained, met those conditions exactly. The trellis panels were open and airy, the combined height stayed under the cap, and the panel placement kept everything behind the front building line of the house. Finally, I laid out the other approvals I had found in the records. I showed photos of side yard trellises, decorative screens near the front corners of homes, and then, last, the approval for Miss Carter's own patio privacy screen. I did not say her name out loud, I did not need to. The house number on the form spoke for itself. I finished by saying that all I wanted was consistent application of the rules. If those projects were acceptable, visible from the street yet approved as compliant, then my fence and trellis, which met the same written standards and the city's safety code, should be approved as well. The board members shifted in their seats. The treasurer glanced at the management representative, who leaned in to whisper something to him. Mr. K stared at the documents in front of him for a long moment. You could feel the room leaning forward, the air holding a collective breath. It struck me then that the board was no longer just deciding what happened to my fence, they were deciding whether to expose themselves to an official challenge that could force them to explain, in a formal setting, why some neighbors got quick approvals while others got midnight violations and threats of four-figure legal fees. The management representative spoke up in a measured tone, suggesting that the board might consider my revised plan a creative compromise that both met the written standards and addressed neighbor privacy concerns. It was a way for them to back down without admitting they had overreached. One of the at-large members cleared his throat and said he was comfortable with the trellis concept, as long as the open spacing of the panels was clearly documented. The treasurer hesitated but then nodded, perhaps realizing that denying a fully compliant design, after everything I had laid out, would be hard to justify if I decided to push back beyond the meeting room. After a brief discussion among themselves, Mr. K announced that the board would approve my revised fence and trellis design as submitted, with the condition that the trellis panels remain at least 50% open. They would send a written approval letter within a week. It was not an apology. It was not an admission of wrongdoing. But it was exactly what I needed. As I sat back down, I could feel a shift in the room. A few neighbors smiled at me. Someone gently tapped a knuckle against their chair leg in a quiet show of support. Near the back, I saw Miss Carter sitting with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. For once, she did not look triumphant. The meeting moved on, but the energy never quite returned to its earlier, stiff rhythm. The board members seemed more careful in their wording. When other owners brought up small issues, mailbox repairs, landscaping questions, the responses were less dismissive, more measured. The board had just been reminded that their authority was not unlimited, and they knew it. The approval letter arrived 3 days later, printed on letterhead, stamped, and signed. It confirmed that my fence and trellis design were approved, in accordance with Bylaw 7.3 and applicable city code. I slid it into the binder, right next to the earlier notices, like the final chapter in a slim but satisfying HOA revenge story. The next call I made was to my contractor. He sounded amused when I explained what had happened, but he agreed to slot us back in. Within a week, his crew was back in our cul-de-sac, unloading lumber and trellis panels. The smell of fresh-cut wood and the rhythmic thud of hammers filled the air, blending with the whir of saws and the occasional chirp of a bird startled from a tree. They set the 6-foot fence panels first, solid and clean along the side and rear yard. The sense of enclosure was immediate. For the first time since we moved in, our yard felt like a private space. No more direct line of sight from Miss Carter's windows to our patio. No more dog barking at every passerby. Then came the trellis. They mounted the open lattice panels above the fence, aligning them perfectly so that the combined height sat just under the maximum allowed by the bylaw. From our side, it felt like a soft, airy wall that reached up toward the sky, ready to host climbing vines and string lights. From the street, the structure was clearly visible, but it looked intentional and well-designed, not imposing. I stood in the yard, watching the panels go up, and caught a glimpse of Miss Carter on her porch. She watched the work with a tight jaw, her posture rigid. Every new panel meant a little less of my yard in her line of sight. And the best part was, there was nothing she could do about it this time. The structure was fully approved, fully documented, and fully compliant with both the city code and the very bylaw the board had tried to use against me. Over the next few months, the aftermath unfolded in small, satisfying ways. We added planter boxes at the base of the trellis and planted climbing jasmine and clematis. By midsummer, thin green vines had begun to weave through the open lattice, small blossoms appearing here and there like quiet fireworks. In the evenings, the scent of the jasmine drifted across the patio, blending with the sound of crickets and the distant hum of air conditioners. Our dog calmed down noticeably. With the visual barrier in place, he barked less at passing neighbors. The yard felt peaceful. We could sit outside under the soft glow of string lights, talk, and let the kids play without feeling like we were performing for an audience. The association, for its part, seemed changed. They still sent reminders and notices, but the tone shifted. The next community-wide letter about yard maintenance referenced the relevant bylaws more carefully and politely. The management company started mentioning certified mail and owner hearing rights more consistently. It was as if my case had reminded them that the documents were not just weapons, they were also constraints. At meetings, more owners started showing up. People asked sharper questions. When the board tried to push through a new rule about overnight parking, several residents asked exactly how it would be enforced and whether there would be a grace period. The board, clearly aware of the binder in my hands, answered with more caution. As for Ms. Carter, her role in the neighborhood shifted too. She spent less time walking the street with her tablet at the ready. Her once constant presence on the sidewalk diminished. Maybe it was the trellis blocking her favorite vantage point. Maybe it was the sense that her complaints no longer guaranteed swift, unquestioned action. One afternoon, I saw a small, pale envelope tucked into the doorframe of her house. A friend down the street later mentioned that the board had cited her for an unapproved decorative light fixture and a storage bin that was visible from the front. Nothing major, just the kind of thing she used to report others for. I did not gloat. I did not need to. It was enough to know that the rules were finally being applied evenly, that the same scrutiny she had demanded for others now applied to her too. In quiet moments, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I had cut the fence down immediately, paid any fines without question, and tried to stay invisible, the board would have learned the opposite lesson, that pressure and intimidation worked every time. Instead, they learned that some homeowners will read the rules, remember them, and push back when authority stretches beyond its written limits. This whole saga started as a stressful, frustrating chapter in our lives, but in the end, it turned into something strangely satisfying. It taught me that the best form of petty revenge in a homeowners association drama is not screaming or retaliating in secret, it is forcing the people in charge to live by the exact rules they love to wave at everyone else. And while the trellis might just look like wood and lattice and vines to anyone driving by, to me it stands as a quiet, everyday reminder that boundaries, both literal and figurative, are worth defending when those in power decide they get to redraw them at will. The abuse of power did not vanish overnight, but it now had a boundary line as real as the fence itself. Tell me your HOA horror in one line.